Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are going to be working in our backyard in our cut flower garden, and we are going to be talking about saving dahlia seeds, which is a topic I'm so excited about because there are so much possibilities with this topic and with dahlia seeds, and it's something that I hope you yourself try out in your garden this year. So I want to dive into it, kind of get into the nitty-gritty things about this topic, and I want to show you my process for saving dahlia seeds. But first, let's talk about why people save dahlia seeds and the difference between growing dahlias from seeds versus tubers. To begin with, there are only two ways that you can grow a dahlias true to form, and that's either by growing it from a tuber, or you can take a cutting from that tuber, grow it out, and that will be the same clone. Where if you grow dahlias from seeds, they are genetically different than the parent plant that they came from, which means you could potentially discover a whole new dahlia. If you think about Cafe au Lait, one of our favorites, that one was discovered by a seed, and so are all of the varieties that we grow and that you grow in your garden, which, if you think about that for a minute, how cool is that? Now again, if I want to grow any of these varieties true to what they are, I'm going to have to grow them from a tuber, or I can also take a cutting in the late winter, early springtime and plant those out, and those will come back true and a clone of any of these parent dahlias that we have here. Now again, the cool thing about growing dahlias from seeds is growing from seeds introduces genetic variation, so the resulting plant may look different from the actual parent that it came from. If we look at this dahlia over here, this is Venus. So if I take the seeds from Venus and I grow these out next year, they will come back completely different than this actual plant. Seeds are created through cross-pollination, where the traits of two parent plants combine. Unlike tubers, seeds carry genetic material from both parents, meaning that the offspring may have different characteristics than the actual parent plant that it came from. Now, the seeds that you harvest will share similar traits depending which dahlia it came from. So for example, Venus over here is a colorette, and if I go ahead and harvest the seeds from this one, it's probably not going to produce a lot of ball varieties or dinner plate varieties. It will probably start producing flowers similar to this one. So I'm sure there are going to be a lot of singles. Maybe you're going to get a couple of doubles, but for the most part, they will kind of have the same traits as the parent plant that they came from. So if you think about that for a minute, that means you can discover something that has never been seen before. And that, to me, is so exciting, and how new dahlias are being discovered year after year after year. And the best part about saving seeds is it costs nothing. It just requires a little bit of your time. And if you want to grow a ton of dahlias but not necessarily spend a ton of money on investing on tubers, then you can grow dahlias from seeds. And just one thing for you to think about: one single dahlia pod that you harvest can have upwards of 100 seeds, which potentially means 100 completely different new dahlias. That to me is so wild. So now that we got that out of the way, let me show you what I like to do and how to harvest your dahlia seeds, and when is the perfect time to go ahead and start collecting them. This is what I like to use. I want to make sure that I have clean pruners. We've talked about how I will sanitize my shears between each plant that I harvest anything from. We also have some plant tags. We have our organza bags, which we talked about in our previous video. I have a little mason jar in case we need to have some in water. And then I have some pens. I like this garden marker. And then you will also need a paper bag. This is for later. And the tray is also for later. So let's actually get out there and start harvesting some seeds. I will show you guys which stage to collect them, and then we will come back and talk about how you're going to store your seeds once you have them. So depending when you harvest your seeds will determine whether or not you can store your seeds right away, or you might have to place them in a vase with a little bit of water for several weeks to allow them to dry. We live in the Pacific Northwest, so we get a lot of rain this time of year, which means a lot of our seed heads will rot, or a lot of them are just really juicy. So it's hard for me to pick ones that are really dry, which is fine. It just means that, again, I harvest my seed heads when they're a little less ripe, and I will keep them indoors to ripen inside. One thing I wanted to mention is if you do want to save seeds, this is the time where you want to back off on deadheading or harvesting some of your dahlias, because you want to let them go to seed. And the great thing about doing it now too is they're pumping out a lot of blooms because they are trying to go go to seed, because that's what plants want to do. So there's plenty of seeds for us to harvest at this time. And it usually takes about 6 weeks from when your dahlias bloom to when they start setting seed. So give yourself plenty of time if you want to harvest seed. So let's have a look at Venus here, because this dahlia has a lot of different stages that I think we can take a look at. So starting out, we have them in bud. So I'm just gonna cut this bud off so you can see. So this is a bud, and you can tell it's a bud because it's nice and round and it hasn't bloomed yet. So this is the bud stage of Venus. And then of course we have the flower, which, my gosh, she is so beautiful. I love her. I'm gonna put her in my pocket. I don't want it to go to waste. And then we have Venus here after it's done blooming. Actually, let's go back. Hold on. Let's go back. Let's go here. Just when it's starting to fade, it's pretty much done blooming and it's going to start losing its petals. And then you're going to be left with this yellow center with some of the pollen. And we already know that this is spent. And then you're going to have Venus like this, where it's going to start closing up. You can see this is not the right stage to harvest. It's too open, it's too fresh. You want to wait a little bit longer. Now here is where it gets good. When you start to see your seed pods become pointy like this, do you see how it's not rounded but they're pointy? This is the stage where you want to start paying attention to them and when you can start harvesting them. These are still considered not ripe. This is still a very green seed pod, but at this stage I could harvest this and let them finish indoors. Now I will open this up so you guys can see what the inside looks like. And first you can tell it's really juicy, so if you squeeze it, there's just some of that juice coming out, so we know it's not ready. And here's a problem that we face here in the Northwest. It gets so wet that a lot of times our seeds will just rot. But if I look here we go. This is what the inside looks like. Not a whole lot. But here are a bunch of green seeds that did not ripen. Do you see that? I'll pop up a picture because that might be able to be a little bit more detailed. Now this one is starting to turn brown and it's almost at the stage where we can harvest. In fact, once they're like this, I might just go ahead and harvest that and let it get drier indoors. But for the sake of education, let me show you what that looks like. You can tell, let's just cut off some of this yucky brown stuff. You can tell that the seeds, again, in here are still not ripe. They're just very green. There's lots of seeds in here, but these are not ripe yet. Now, when they get to this stage here, where they're starting to really just turn brown and papery, this is where we want to start harvesting them. Typically, I would wait until this whole thing is dark and brown, but I know I'm just not going to get that because it's just been so wet for us. Now in our garden, it's typically hard for me to harvest seed heads that are ripe and dry and papery and ready to go. I usually harvest mine, all of mine, at this stage right here. So when it's just turning brown, it's dark, it's still a tiny bit juicy, but not quite as juicy as some of the other ones. But this is still not a ripe seed pod. But what I do is I remove any of the leaves on the stem, and then I take this inside and put it in a little mason jar with water, and I'll change out the water every few days, or like every 4 days. And then I will leave them in there to ripen, and it usually takes a couple of weeks, sometimes 3 weeks. I've had ones take a month. So I keep them in an area that I'm not going to move them, but it's a nice, bright, dry area. That part doesn't really matter as much, but you just want to make sure that you harvest them when they start to feel papery and brown. And then you can just peel off the stem and break the actual head off, and then put it in a paper bag and shake it around, and it will start releasing, the seeds will start releasing from the little husks around the seed pods, which is very cool. And I have one to show you guys, but that's usually the stage that you want to harvest them. You can harvest them when they're a little bit greener. Let's see. So you could technically harvest at this stage. You can see it's very pale green. However, I just like to start seeing a little bit of brown in ours, but you could harvest at this stage. It just might take a little bit longer indoors to dry. I probably wouldn't harvest at this stage. You can see it's still very open. It just recently lost its petals. If I open it up, I mean, I guess there is some seeds developing in there. However, that's just a little bit too early for me. But if you've harvested this early, let me know if you've had good success with it. But I usually wait until they're like this or a little bit brown, and then I take them indoors and wait for them to ripen. Sometimes what can happen is if it's raining a lot, these petals will just kind of fold back onto that seed head and it will rot. So what you could do is start coming out and removing some of those petals from your dahlias. So that way they're nice and clean like this. Put the organza bag right over it. So you tag it and then let this start close up and become pointy so you can start harvesting that one. Here's an example of how those petals were left on. And you might think, well, this is nice and dry and papery, but what happened is the petals just folded onto the actual head, their seed head. And if you peel it back, you can see everything just sort of rotted and there's nothing in there. So that's why timing is important. I would rather harvest them when they're a little bit ripe versus letting them go too far and then this happens. Of course, again, you can always come in and just start peeling some of them off and putting an organza bag on there, but that can happen. Here is a variety called K.A. Peach, one of my favorites, and I put an organza bag over it and it did dry out, but let's see what these look like. It looks pretty papery. It's not often that this happens for me. So if I take it, let's see. Oh, yeah, there's some seeds in here. Not a lot. Now you can gently blow to start removing some of that husk, but let's see here. Well, there's a few. I knew this one wasn't going to be super reliable just because it was starting to rot already, but there's a couple good ones in here. So ideally, if you don't have a lot of rain and they get dry like that, that's when you'd want to harvest. And that way you don't have to take them inside, put them in a vase. You can just go straight into a little drying area and let them get nice and dry before you store them. So there's a couple in here that you know what, I might actually just save them. Why not? So here are ones that I've harvested and I'll just put them in a little vase with a little bit of water. These are all of the same variety, and typically the ones that I harvest, I will have a organza bag right over it just like this. And if you have multiple that you just want to keep in the same water, you can do that. What I would do is just make sure that you label them. That way I don't lose track of where these seeds are going to be coming from. So I'll usually put the date and the variety name, and I'll just leave them in there just like this until I am ready to harvest all of the seeds inside that seed pod. Now, after a few weeks, when these dry out and get nice and brown and papery, they will look like this. So this variety is also Venus, and I had this stem in water for a couple of weeks. I then tore out all of the seeds from the actual seed head. I put it in a paper bag, shook it up, and then just poured it back into my tray here. And you can see they're still drying just a little bit. They still feel a little bit moist to the touch. Inside the seed pod, you're going to get a mix of good seeds and then some things that are not viable. And let me show you what that looks like. So you'll often see these little black, tiny, skinny, slender things. This is not a seed. That's not viable. Anything that looks like this is not viable. This one is questionable. It's very small, but we'll keep it. Anything that's broken in half, I also don't keep. And if I'm being very picky, I'll also throw away these really skinny things and just keep the nice, plump seeds. So you see how they're nice and plump? They're usually a dark gray. These are all viable and potentially brand new dahlias that we've never seen before. Once the seed head has dried out and is becoming kind of papery and crumbly, and you break it up either by hand or in the paper bag to separate some of the seeds, you want to make sure you lay everything out in a nice thin layer to really let it dry. You can do this on a cooking sheet, in a box like I'm doing here, just somewhere where there's going to be a lot of ventilation to allow everything to get nice and dry before they go into storage. Once everything is nice and dry, I will store them in little envelopes, and then I will go ahead and start these indoors probably about a month or two before our last frost. And then I will get them planted out with the rest of our seedlings. And that's all there is to it. It's such an easy thing to do, and the reward and payoff is so worth it because you could potentially discover the next cafe au lait. And that is super, super exciting. Now, again, keep in mind, if your seed heads are not quite dry on your plant, that's okay. Just make sure you cut them, bring them inside, have them in a little bit of water, change out the water if it's getting kind of gross and yucky, and then just wait until they get nice and crispy and dry, and you'll be ready to harvest them then. Make sure your seeds are completely dry before you store them, because you don't want to go through all of this work, not that it's a ton of work, but you don't want to go through this, this time that you've invested and then have them rot in storage. So make sure you store them with the rest of your seeds in a nice, dark, cool area until you're ready to plant them. And now the cool thing about growing dahlias from seeds is when you plant them out, they will grow into a full plant, produce beautiful flowers that very first year, and they'll even produce little baby tubers. And if it's a dahlia that you like, then you can start saving that little clump of tubers that it will develop and then grow that out the following year, and then you can start dividing and continue growing that dahlia that you just discovered. Now obviously you will get some that are not winners, and that's okay, that's part of the fun. But imagine walking through the rows of these new flowers that you just planted, all of these new seedlings that you harvested, you saved, you planted out, and then you come across something magical, and then you get to tell the whole world about it. First, come tell me, because I'd be super excited, and then share that with people if that's something that you're interested in doing. And it's, again, that's how all of the breeders are doing it. There's no secret to it. This is how it's being done. All right, well, that will do it for today's video. I hope this was insightful and it motivated you to give it a try. Again, it's such a fun activity to do, super easy, super rewarding, and it literally cost us nothing. All right, guys, as always, if you have any questions, drop them down below. Let me know if this video was helpful. And yeah, thank you guys again for hanging out with me today in my garden, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.